Hello friends, for today's video we're going to be doing a non-spoiler review for To Shape a Dragon's Breath. And before getting into the synopsis or any specifics, if you are somebody that finds you tend to have tastes that overlap with mine pretty strongly, then chances are you don't even have to watch the rest of this review, because I thought that this book was absolutely fantastic, and as stated, if you tend to have similar tastes to me, chances are you're going to really like this one as well. But for those of you that need to hear a little bit more, I want to give specifics as to what I thought made this book such a standout and why it was so fantastic. I'll go ahead and start though with the synopsis. The setup is that you follow this young woman named Anakus who has grown up on the island of Masquapog, and they have not seen dragons on this island for many years. However, at the very beginning of the story, there is a dragon that flies through, and Anakus ends up finding its egg. It hatches, and then it is very quickly established that they are not allowed to raise this dragon and keep it for themselves. They need to actually have her go to a school so she can learn how to be a dragoneer, and that she can learn how to shape her dragon's breath. And the way that the magic and basically the steampunk elements of the story fit into the dragon's breath, I thought was really creative and really interesting. The idea is that they have these transformative powers essentially through the dragon's breath, and that these can really help innovation. And the people that have conquered a lot of this area, the English, are the ones that have decided how a dragon's breath is meant to be used and who has the means and the abilities to shape a dragon's breath. For many years since the conquering of this area, the English haven't really allowed for essentially anybody of Anakus's descent to have any contribution to anything to do with the dragons. However, legally, currently, they are not really able to take the dragon from her. What they can force her to do is attend this school and try to learn their ways. And oftentimes within the story, as it progresses, she is not just learning how to shape the dragon's breath. She is also being told all the ways that her people are not civilized, all the ways that she has the luck of being able to come to this school, and how she's so fortunate. Even though she loved her way of life, even though she loves her family and her culture, she is constantly being told over and over and over again why her people are so behind and so backwards. Despite the fact that Anakus does not appreciate being spoken to this way, being treated this way, if she wants to be able to continue having a relationship with her dragon, she essentially has to put up with this treatment, and so she does. And the bond between her and her dragon is really sweet, but also just in general, anything to do with the dragons was really fascinating. Currently, a lot of the ones that you see are very, very young, as they've only recently hatched, and there are different kinds of dragons, so that's touched on here and there throughout the story. They are much more animal-like in this, although they feel animal-like with hints of something that is slightly magical within them, as opposed to some stories that have dragons where the dragons are much more like people, that they talk in some fashion. It's not really like that, as I stated. It's much more animal-like, and the magical components are very much rooted in the literal existence of there being dragons in this world, but also in the abilities of the dragons. And this plays a role into the school setting and what Anakus is studying. The magic in this was incredibly complex. The way it worked is very scientific, and there are some discoveries as the story progresses as to how some of Anakus's people in the past were able to utilize a dragon's breath versus why they aren't now, and how that relates to what's going on with what she's being taught. But the idea is that it is very scientific, and there are aspects to it that feel very much rooted in chemical and borderline alchemical experimentation. To give you a little bit of an idea, at the beginning you do see this chart. If you are somebody who loves a magic system that feels like there are rules and limitations, but especially if you feel like there's a scientific approach to a magic system, I think you'll absolutely love the way that this one is executed. I actually would go as far as to say that it bordered on being so scientific that it didn't really feel magical anymore. That's going to be a pro for some and a con for others. For me, it just kind of was one of those situations where I thought, whatever you say, I believe that you've thought it through. It's not a magic system where I personally feel like I fully understand the rules and limitations, but I actually thought that fit really well with Anakusa's journey throughout her schooling, because she is struggling at times and she's trying to learn, and there are restrictions on how she's able to go about her learning, which is explored really well throughout the story. But I did feel like I was alongside her, having some of this essentially go over my head. It really created that feeling of being a student and trying to understand, but also being treated as not good enough to ask questions, not being allowed to try and fill in the gaps, because she's not somebody who's had experience with education in their area up through this point. She has so much knowledge in so many other ways. However, they treat her as less than because she hasn't been brought up to be taught the exact things that they deem valuable, but they don't allow for her to really try and understand all the things that she hasn't been taught previously. So you get to, just beside her, have that fish out of water experience. Also, I think naturally a lot of us want to root for the underdog. We want to root for that character that is pushing back against an oppressive system. And Anakus is one of my favorite protagonists that I've encountered, in that she has such a drive. She's so brilliant. She is somebody that approaches everything with so much logic, but she is very, very quietly resilient, which I think speaks to her strength. She recognizes the society for what it is and how it functions. She's able to look around her and assess, and then take certain things in, recognize what is valuable, and also recognize what is absolutely a product of essentially propaganda, what people have been told time and time and time again. A book that I would compare this to, actually, and it's something I've read not that long ago, and it's another one that I was singing its praises, would be Blood Over Brighthaven. I would essentially say, what if Blood Over Brighthaven had a significantly more likable main character? And I will say, I liked the main character for how she was written in Blood Over Brighthaven, but she is not likable. She is part of the problem, you could say. This character, though, is essentially like a much more likable and kind of quieter character in general than that one in Blood Over Brighthaven. She's not abrasive like that character was, but she is very intelligent. She's in a somewhat similar environment. She is being mistreated within this school setting, even though she is brilliant and she has so much to offer. But you're essentially taking a lot of what is liked about Blood Over Brighthaven and you're adding dragons. That's the perfect mix, I feel like, for so many of us. It certainly was an amazing mix for me, but then also tying in a lot to do with our own history. This book is not hiding whatsoever its inspirations. They are very much at the forefront of this, and this is especially true for, if you just look at the map at the beginning of the book, you can see that it is absolutely rooted in our own world. To show you a little bit of that, you can see it does not look all that different from our own world. Not too long ago, there was actually an article written about how there isn't really such a thing as the American fantasy novel in the same way that we have something like Lord of the Rings and what it represents for Tolkien's country of origin. While I don't necessarily entirely agree with the general premise of that article, I do think that if we're looking for something that feels like a quintessential American fantasy novel, or at the very least a reflection on how groups of people were treated in a certain time and place in the West, I think that this book absolutely represents that. It is showcasing characters that don't often get to have their own perspectives. It is examining history through the lens of fantasy, and also it's incorporating fantasy elements through the steampunk and how the steampunk pieces are integrated into the advancements of society. It's doing all those things in a really innovative way while still packing a punch. And while I do think it is fitting for the certain time and place that it is inspired by, there are so many instances of quotes that you could pull directly from it and apply it now. And that's one of the most powerful things about this, and one of the things that is the most upsetting, because you want to believe that society isn't like that right now. You want to believe that this is so almost overt to the point of lacking subtlety, but in actuality, there are still people that think the way that some of the people in this story think. There are still people that justify how they view other people and how they treat other people simply because of the things that they've been taught and that they have not pushed back on and challenged. So as far as the protagonist goes, as far as the thematic elements go, and as far as the setting goes, I think that this is exceptional. Another thing that really stood out to me, though, is how well executed the side characters were. There wasn't really a single side character written in a way where you couldn't understand where they were coming from. It doesn't mean that all of the ways that they behaved and thought were justifiable necessarily, but I do think that the author wrote them in a way where they felt realistic and that you could understand how their environment had shaped them. And this came in so many different ways. This is often through the other characters that Anakus is going to school alongside. For example, there is a character that is one of the only other girls going to this school, and this young lady is somebody who has grown up in high society, and she tries as much as possible in the ways that she has been taught is proper to be kind to people, to be understanding, and try to help people, especially people who are below her station, because that's what a good person would do. Somebody who has her privilege, they would reach down and help lift people up. But who she deems beneath her and why she feels the need to lift them up are often insulting and rooted in this idea that you are better simply because you have a certain amount of wealth, and that accumulation of wealth, how you accumulated it, and what you value isn't necessarily the same as it is for other people, which makes for actually really great interactions between this character whose name is Marta and Anakus. I thought some of their interactions were very, very powerful, and what I think made this character very well-rounded is she's just trying through a really warped lens that, as I stated, is very much a product of her society, and she's shaped by her society. She's shaped by her environment. Another thing, though, that made this character really fascinating was the fact that she is somebody who clearly has faced a certain amount of pushback for the fact that she is a girl, and she's a high society girl who wants to pursue something with dragons that is typically seen as something more so for boys. So you do see her pushing back in her own ways, but then she very much is fitting and upholding certain other things in other areas, which I think made for some great contrasts. Another character who I thought probably was my favorite character in the entire book was Theod. This is a character who, like Anakus, is not of the English. However, he grew up among them. He was around them since the time that he was very young, and he's been told time and time and time again how he is so lucky that his upbringing, he's so fortunate to not have to grow up the way people like Anakus have. And so he grows up with this view of himself and how he should essentially be grateful for everybody tolerating his presence, basically. And he really believes this until Anakus kind of tells him why, but why though? And also they don't treat you like an equal. And the dissection of that and how it was executed was phenomenal and heartbreaking, and probably created for the most emotional moments within the book. We also see a character that grew up in high society who is a young boy who is mistreated because of how he is able to express himself and the ways that there are limitations in how he can express himself, and how it feels like nobody is willing to meet him where he is, even though he's actually exceptionally brilliant. And sometimes these characters have support from family members, sometimes they have support from friends, but then other characters are treating them in a way that is very negative, or society as a whole treats them as very negative. There's not any one character that feels like they are ultimately the absolute perfect character or the absolute perfect villain character. And I only am mentioning some of the side characters that Anakus goes to school with. There is also a lot of interesting reflection on how their society has shaped the adults, and that includes Anakus's family, which that is something a lot of us really appreciate in fantasy, when the characters actually have a family unit, or at least some family members, and how all of that is done is exceptional. Everything to do with Anakus's father, her grandmother, one of her brothers, specifically her older brother, and how his way of living and how he's trying to do what he can for his family clashes with what her father's view is for him and for his children in general. Then you also have people that work at the school who have their own backstories that sort of fit into everything that you slowly start to discover, and it just made for all of the interactions and all of the reveals to be so interesting. I also want to add, I don't know if there's ever been a book that has better explored a love triangle than this book. I'm not a fan of love triangles. I don't know that I can even point to a story where I think there's a love triangle I like, but this is one of the only stories where I can say that I thought the love triangle was actually really, really well done. In general, I thought To Shape a Dragon's Breath was absolutely amazing, fantastic. I basically don't really have any criticisms. It's the first book in a series. My only thing is I don't want to have to wait for the next one, I suppose. I thought it was fantastic. I hope a lot of people check this out. I think it deserves so much more attention and so much more hype. And on that note, I want to say a huge thank you to those of you who actually suggested this to me, as it was through your recommendation that I picked this up and discovered it. So thank you so much. I don't always get the chance to read the things that you recommend, but I, one, always appreciate your recommendations, and two, I try to get around to as many as possible. And this one really was amazing. So thank you so much for bringing it to my attention. I hope, as I said, that more people check it out because I think it is fantastic. If you have more you'd like to add, anything I didn't touch on that you thought was exceptional within this, feel free to mention that in the comments down below. Thanks so much for watching though. I hope you have a great rest of your day, and I'll see you later. Bye.